Divide and Rule: How the British Kept India Under Control. Part 4 of the 10-part India series, The Colonization of India. When the British first arrived in India, they were a small trading company with no power and no army but to trade. Yet within a few centuries, they had taken control of an entire subcontinent. But how did a foreign power, thousands of miles away, manage to rule over millions of Indians for nearly 200 years? The answer lies in a brilliant but sinister strategy: divide and rule. The British did not conquer India through military strength alone. They turned Indians against each other, exploited existing divisions, and created new ones to ensure that Indians would never unite against them. By keeping Indians divided by caste, religion, language, and region, the British ensured that India remained weak while they remained in power. This is the story of how the British used psychological warfare, manipulated Indian rulers, and deliberately fostered divisions, a legacy that still affects India to this day. The early divide, playing Indian kingdoms against each other. Long before India became a British colony, it was a land of diverse kingdoms, empires, and princely states. The British saw this as an opportunity. They realized that if India remained divided, it would never be able to resist British rule. How the British exploited Indian rulers to maintain control. The British did not initially arrive in India as conquerors. They came as traders under the banner of the East India Company, EIC. Their goal was not just to trade, but to control trade, and for that, they needed to gain political power over Indian rulers, bribing Indian rulers, nawabs, and sultans to fight their own countrymen. The British made alliances with local rulers, pretending to offer military or economic support, while secretly fueling rivalries between neighboring kingdoms. They used bribery as a tool, promising certain rulers exclusive trading rights, financial incentives, and British military backing, in exchange for betraying their fellow Indian rulers. Many Indian rulers saw the British as mere merchants and did not realize that these alliances were actually designed to destabilize their power. Supporting one Indian kingdom against another, only to betray them later. The British often promised protection to one kingdom while secretly arming its rival, ensuring constant warfare. After one kingdom was weakened through war, the British would switch sides, betraying their former allies and annexing the weakened territory. This strategy was repeated all across India, ensuring that no kingdom could grow powerful enough to resist British expansion. Exploiting succession disputes, deciding who would rule. Many Indian kingdoms had internal struggles over succession, where different princes or nobles claimed the throne. The British intervened in these disputes, backing the weaker or more dependent candidate, ensuring that the new ruler would be loyal to the British. In many cases, they installed puppet rulers who were only kings in name. Real power remained in British hands. These methods allowed the British to gain political power without direct warfare. Indian rulers were unknowingly handing over control to their own future colonizers. The Battle of Plassey, 1757, is one of the earliest and clearest examples of this strategy. The British didn't win the battle through military strength. They bribed Mir Jafar, a commander in the Bengal army, to betray his own ruler. This strategy was repeated across India, ensuring that Indian rulers never united against British expansion. The Battle of Plassey was the first major turning point in British expansion, and it perfectly demonstrated how the British didn't need military strength to conquer India. They only needed to manipulate Indians against each other. At the time, Bengal was one of the richest provinces in India, controlled by Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah. The British, led by Robert Clive, wanted control over Bengal's trading ports, economy, and administration. Instead of facing a direct war, Clive secretly negotiated with Mir Jafar, the commander of the Bengal army, promising him the throne if he betrayed Siraj-ud-Dowlah. On June 23, 1757, the Battle of Plassey began. The British army was vastly outnumbered. Siraj-ud-Dowlah had over 50,000 troops, while the British had only around 3,000 soldiers. But at the crucial moment, Mir Jafar and his men refused to fight, leaving Siraj-ud-Dowlah's army weakened and in chaos. The British easily won the battle, not because of superior military strength, but because of Indian betrayal. After the victory, Mir Jafar was installed as the new Nawab, but he soon realized that he was nothing more than a puppet ruler under British control. This blueprint for conquest, turning Indians against each other, installing puppet rulers and controlling trade, was used again and again across India. The religious divide, turning Hindus and Muslims against each other. Before British rule, Hindus and Muslims in India had coexisted for centuries, not just as neighbors, but as rulers, warriors, traders, and citizens of the same land. They had fought side by side against foreign invaders, intermarried among aristocratic families, and built a shared culture that blended elements of both traditions, seen in art, architecture, and music. The British saw this unity as a threat. They understood that a united India would be harder to control. So, instead of fighting Indians directly, they systematically worked to break Hindu-Muslim relations apart, ensuring that both communities saw each other as political enemies rather than allies. The British deliberately created divisions through census records, legal policies, political favoritism, and propaganda, a strategy that ultimately laid the foundation for religious violence and partition in 1947. How the British engineered Hindu-Muslim divisions. British census reports, categorizing Indians by religion to create identity-based politics. Before British rule, Indian society was fluid, people identified by region, language, profession, or caste, rather than strictly by religion. The British introduced census records in 1871, which officially classified Indians based on religion, reinforcing religious identity over regional or cultural unity. This meant that for the first time in Indian history, Hindus and Muslims were counted as separate groups, with their differences emphasized rather than their shared history. Why was this significant? Once people were labeled primarily by religion, it became easier to govern them separately, introduce divide and rule policies, and justify separate political representation. The British manipulated census data to exaggerate differences, portraying Hindus and Muslims as two entirely different communities with opposing interests. This was a deliberate shift from pre-colonial India, where religious identity had never been the primary marker of division. Communal representation laws, politically dividing Hindus and Muslims. Once the British had created a religious divide through census reports, they took it further by enacting separate political laws for Hindus and Muslims. In 1909, the British introduced separate electorates, meaning Hindus could only vote for Hindu candidates, Muslims could only vote for Muslim candidates. This ensured that Hindus and Muslims no longer competed together in politics. Instead, they were forced to see each other as political rivals. Instead of uniting against British colonial rule, Hindu and Muslim leaders were made to compete for British favors and political power under a rigged system. This was one of the most dangerous policies introduced by the British, as it planted the seeds of long-term religious division in Indian politics. The promotion of separate religious identities, keeping Hindus and Muslims distrustful of each other. Once the British politically divided Hindus and Muslims, they took the next step, encouraging the formation of separate religious organizations instead of united political groups. The British supported the Muslim League in 1906, presenting it as a counterweight to the Indian National Congress, which was largely Hindu-dominated at the time. They also encouraged Hindu nationalist movements, ensuring that both sides distrusted each other. This strategy ensured that Muslims saw the Congress as a Hindu party, and Hindus saw the Muslim League as an anti-national force. The goal was simple: prevent a united Indian independence movement. The Partition of Bengal, 1905, how the British physically divided Hindus and Muslims. Perhaps the biggest example of British divide and rule came in 1905, when they partitioned Bengal along religious lines. Bengal was one of the largest provinces in India, with a strong nationalist movement against British rule. To weaken this movement, the British divided Bengal into two separate regions: West Bengal, a Hindu-majority province; East Bengal, a Muslim-majority province. This was the first time India had been physically divided based on religion, creating communal tensions that had never existed before. Hindus and Muslims, who had lived together for centuries, suddenly found themselves separated, fostering resentment, suspicion, and hostility. Even though the partition was reversed in 1911 due to mass protests, the damage had already been done. The idea of separate Hindu and Muslim states had been introduced, fueling demands for Pakistan decades later. Religious divisions, which had never been the main cause of conflict before, became central to Indian politics. The partition of Bengal was not about administration. It was about engineering communal divisions that would keep India distracted with internal conflicts, rather than uniting against British rule. The long-term impact of the British religious divide. The British did not create Hindu-Muslim differences, but they exploited and intensified them to ensure that Indians would never unite against them. By emphasizing religious identity over cultural unity, the British fractured Indian society permanently. Political conflicts between Hindus and Muslims deepened, ultimately leading to the demand for a separate Muslim state, Pakistan, and the eventual partition in 1947. Even today, the political and social divisions caused by British rule continue to affect India and Pakistan, fueling tensions that originated from colonial strategies. The greatest success of British rule was not just in conquering India, but in ensuring that even after they left, India would remain divided. The caste system had existed in India for centuries, but its rigid, institutionalized form was largely a British creation. Prior to colonial rule, caste was a flexible social structure where mobility was possible, and many Indian rulers worked to reduce caste-based discrimination through land reforms, education, and military inclusion. However, the British saw caste as a convenient tool to divide Indian society and engineered policies that turned caste from a social structure into a permanent and oppressive political category. The British did not create caste divisions, but they institutionalized and reinforced them, making caste-based identity more rigid than ever before. They did this through caste-based censuses, discriminatory laws, electoral policies, and social engineering to ensure that different caste groups saw each other as competitors rather than uniting against British rule. The British conducted caste-based censuses, reinforcing social divisions. Before British rule, caste identities were often fluid and varied by region. People moved between castes through occupation, marriage, and social mobility. However, when the British introduced the first comprehensive caste census in 1871, it froze caste identities into rigid, unchangeable categories and created a permanent hierarchy enforced by the colonial government. The British categorized every Indian into a caste group, officially recording it in government data for the first time in history. People who had historically lived outside of strict caste identities were now forced into rigid classifications, limiting their social mobility. Many occupational groups that previously had status flexibility were labeled as low castes, restricting their ability to participate in trade, administration, and governance. Why was this dangerous? Once caste was officially recorded, it became a legal and administrative tool for British policies. Caste divisions became more permanent, making it harder for lower caste groups to improve their social status. The British used caste as a justification for governing India, claiming that Indians were too divided to rule themselves. Before colonial rule, caste was primarily a localized and community-based identity. After the British census system, it became a permanent, government-imposed division that controlled access to education, jobs, and political power. Caste-based reservations and separate electorates, dividing Indians politically. The British took caste-based divisions beyond social categories and introduced them into the political system. The Indian Councils Act of 1909, Morley Minto reforms, introduced separate electorates based on caste and religion. The Government of India Act of 1935 expanded this, creating reserved seats for different caste groups, ensuring that Indians from different castes competed against each other for political power instead of uniting against the British. The British electoral strategy. Instead of having a unified Indian electorate, the British forced different caste groups to elect their own representatives separately. This meant that political parties had to appeal to caste loyalties rather than a national identity. Caste-based reservations in elections made people vote along caste lines instead of focusing on independence or economic growth. By implementing separate electorates and caste-based reservations, the British ensured that caste divisions became political divisions keeping Indians fighting among themselves rather than against colonial rule. British officials portrayed caste discrimination as an ancient and unchangeable part of Indian society. Before British rule, Indian efforts to reduce caste discrimination. Several pre-colonial Indian rulers had actively worked to reduce caste-based oppression. The Bhakti and Sufi movements preached social equality, rejecting caste divisions, and encouraging people to identify based on faith and community rather than caste. Rulers such as Mysore's Tipu Sultan, the Marathas, and various South Indian dynasties provided land and administrative roles to lower castes, weakening the rigid caste system. How the British reinforced caste as an unchangeable social system. British officials dismissed these reform efforts, instead presenting caste as something permanent and unchangeable. They wrote colonial textbooks and reports that claimed caste was the reason Indians were uncivilized and incapable of self-rule. British laws and administrative policies continued to enforce caste restrictions, making caste discrimination stronger than it had been before colonial rule. This colonial narrative still affects India today, as many discriminatory caste practices that were once weakening before British rule became deeply entrenched under colonial policies. The British transformed caste from a social structure into a tool of political control, ensuring that Indians remain divided along caste lines. Caste-based political divisions remain a major issue in Indian democracy today, a direct consequence of British policies. The deepening of caste identities during colonial rule delayed efforts to create a unified national movement. Indians had to fight both caste oppression and colonial rule at the same time. The rigid caste system introduced by the British disrupted centuries of gradual social mobility, making discrimination stronger in some regions than it had been before British rule. By formalizing caste identities in government policies, British rule deepened social divisions, making it harder for Indians to unite against them. The caste system became a colonial tool, ensuring that India remained divided, not just under British rule, but for generations to come. Divide and rule in the military, the British strategy to control Indian soldiers. Even within the British Indian Army, the British used divide and rule tactics to prevent Indian soldiers from uniting against their colonial rulers. They realized that if Indian soldiers saw each other as brothers, they could rise against the British. So the British created artificial divisions, recruited selectively, and spread internal distrust to ensure that Indian soldiers never saw themselves as a national force. 1. Regiments were created based on caste, religion, and ethnicity. The British Army deliberately divided Indian soldiers into regiments based on caste, religion, and region, ensuring that they remained loyal to their own groups rather than India as a whole. The Madras, Bombay, and Bengal armies were structured along ethnic and religious lines, preventing interaction between soldiers of different backgrounds. Soldiers were forbidden from forming alliances across regiments, ensuring that no collective Indian identity emerged. This made sure that even if a rebellion broke out, only a small section of the army would revolt, while the rest would remain loyal to the British. Number 2. Favoritism in recruitment, rewarding certain communities to weaken nationalism. After the 1857 revolt, the British stopped recruiting soldiers from regions that had participated in the rebellion, such as Bengal, Awadh, and Bihar. Instead, they recruited heavily from communities that had remained loyal, such as Sikhs, Gurkhas, and Pashtuns, labeling them as martial races. By selectively favoring certain groups over others, the British fostered resentment between different Indian communities, ensuring that soldiers saw each other as competitors rather than allies. 3. Indian soldiers were taught that their real enemies were other Indians, not the British. British officers spread propaganda within the army, telling Hindu soldiers that Muslims were their enemies and vice versa. Soldiers were made to believe that they were fighting for their own interests, when in reality, they were being used to suppress their own countrymen. Indian soldiers were deployed against revolts in other regions, ensuring that one Indian group fought another, while British officers simply commanded from above. This strategy became clear during the revolt of 1857, when Hindu and Muslim soldiers fought together against British rule. After crushing the revolt, the British ensured that such unity would never happen again by restructuring the Indian Army to permanently prevent collective rebellion. The Revolt of 1857, the British military's worst fear comes true. The Revolt of 1857 was the biggest challenge to British rule, and it happened because Indian soldiers from different backgrounds fought together. The rebellion began with Hindu and Muslim soldiers, sepoys, in Meerut refusing to use the Enfield rifle cartridges, which were greased with cow and pig fat. The rebellion quickly spread across northern and central India, with soldiers from different castes, religions, and regions fighting together against the British. The British struggled to suppress the revolt because they could not rely on Indian soldiers to remain loyal. The British learned a major lesson from this rebellion. Indians had the potential to unite, and if they ever did, the British Empire in India would collapse. After the rebellion was brutally crushed, the British made major changes to the Indian Army to ensure that such unity would never happen again. The final act, how divide and rule, led to the Partition of India. By the early 20th century, the demand for Indian independence had become unstoppable. The British, realizing that they could not hold on to India forever, made one final move to ensure that even after they left, India would remain weak: partition. For nearly 2 centuries, the British had exploited religious divisions, manipulated political factions, and encouraged communal tensions to maintain their control over India. As independence became inevitable, they deliberately deepened these divisions, ensuring that India would not emerge as a strong, united nation after their departure. The Partition of India in 1947 was not a natural or inevitable event. It was the result of decades of British divide-and-rule policies, culminating in one of the largest and bloodiest forced migrations in human history. The British promoted the idea that Hindus and Muslims could not live together before British rule, a history of Hindu-Muslim coexistence. For centuries, Hindus and Muslims had coexisted in India, often ruling together, trading together, and fighting together against foreign invaders. The Mughal Empire, 1526 to 1857, which ruled over a vast portion of India, was not a purely Islamic empire, but a syncretic rule that incorporated Hindu administrators, warriors, and advisors. The Marathas, the Rajputs, and the Sikh Empire all had Hindu and Muslim alliances, where soldiers and leaders from both communities fought side by side. Intermarriage between Hindu and Muslim royal families was not uncommon, and cultural exchanges led to shared traditions in art, architecture, language, and cuisine. How the British engineered Hindu-Muslim conflict. The British, however, deliberately portrayed Hindus and Muslims as enemies, incapable of living together peacefully. They introduced separate religious electorates in 1909, ensuring that Hindus and Muslims competed against each other in politics instead of working together. They encouraged the idea that Hindus and Muslims had fundamentally different national aspirations, despite centuries of coexistence. British policies ensured that political negotiations happened separately with Hindus and Muslims, reinforcing religious identity over national unity. This systematic policy of fostering communal differences created mistrust, suspicion, and hostility, laying the groundwork for partition. The British negotiated separately with the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. As India's independence movement gained momentum in the early 20th century, 2 major political parties emerged. The Indian National Congress, INC, a largely Hindu-majority party that advocated for a united secular India. The All India Muslim League, AIML, a Muslim-led party that, by the 1940s, began demanding a separate Muslim nation, Pakistan. Instead of encouraging unity, the British exploited the tensions between these groups to create further division. How the British played Congress and the Muslim League against each other. In the 1937 provincial elections, the Congress won a majority in many states, but refused to share power with the Muslim League, leading to resentment. The British deliberately gave more political weight to the Muslim League, even though the League initially did not have mass support among Indian Muslims. British officials negotiated separately with the Congress and the League, ensuring that neither side could find common ground. By the early 1940s, the demand for Pakistan had grown, fueled by the British strategy of encouraging political separatism. The role of communal violence. How the British used riots to justify partition. By the 1940s, British policies had created such deep divisions that communal violence began erupting across India. Instead of working to resolve these tensions, the British used them as an excuse to hasten their exit, ensuring that India would be divided before peace could be restored. Major incidents of communal violence before partition. The Direct Action Day riots, August 16, 1946. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, called for direct action to demand Pakistan. This led to riots in Calcutta, killing over 4,000 people in just a few days. The Bihar massacres, October 1946. In response to the Calcutta riots, Hindus in Bihar launched violent attacks against Muslims, killing thousands. Riots in Punjab and Bengal, entire villages were burned, and trains full of refugees were attacked, leading to thousands of deaths. How the British responded. Instead of controlling the violence, the British used it as proof that Hindus and Muslims could not coexist, further strengthening the argument for partition. Viceroy Lord Mountbatten rushed the process of independence, ensuring that partition happened without a proper transition plan, leading to mass chaos. The British did not provide enough security forces to control the communal violence they had engineered, leading to massacres and the displacement of millions. By allowing communal violence to spiral out of control, the British ensured that India would be divided permanently. On August 15, 1947, India was split into two nations, India and Pakistan. What followed was one of the largest and most violent forced migrations in history. Over 15 million people were displaced, forced to leave their homes overnight. Over 1 million people were killed in riots, massacres, and communal attacks. Thousands of women were abducted, raped, or forcibly converted as communal violence engulfed the region. Entire trains of refugees were slaughtered, with trains arriving at their destinations full of dead bodies. For centuries, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had lived together, but in just a few months, generations of coexistence were destroyed. Families were ripped apart, villages abandoned, and entire communities wiped out. Partition was not just the division of a country. It was the deliberate destruction of a shared cultural history, engineered by British colonial policies. The British legacy, why divide and rule, didn't end in 1947. Even after the British physically left India, their divide and rule strategy continued to shape South Asian politics. India and Pakistan remained in conflict for decades, fighting multiple wars, including over Kashmir, another problem created by British policies. Religious tensions continued within India, with communal violence erupting periodically due to the divisions created by British policies. The British left behind a broken, divided, and traumatized subcontinent, ensuring that South Asia remained politically unstable for decades. Partition was the final success of Britain's divide and rule policy. Even after India and Pakistan became independent, the scars of partition remained. The British had left, but their strategy of turning Indians against each other had worked. The truth about partition, it was not inevitable. Partition was not a historical necessity. It was a British-engineered outcome. For centuries, Hindus and Muslims had lived together, until British policies deliberately tore them apart. The British used religion as a tool to divide India, and when they left, they ensured that those divisions would never be repaired. Partition was not just the end of British rule. It was the final act of colonial destruction, ensuring that even in independence, India and Pakistan would remain divided. Conclusion: the lasting impact of divide and rule. For nearly 2 centuries, the British ruled India not through military strength alone, but by turning Indians against each other. They exploited existing differences, created new ones, and deepened social, political, and religious divides to ensure that Indians would never unite against them. By the time they left in 1947, their divide and rule strategy had caused irreversible damage, fracturing Indian society along caste, religious, and regional lines, culminating in the bloody Partition of India. But the effects of British policies did not end with independence. The divisions they created continue to shape India, Pakistan, and South Asia today. The British left, but their divisions remained. The caste system, once more fluid, became a rigid and institutionalized hierarchy, further deepened by British census policies. Hindu-Muslim relations, which had once been based on coexistence, were turned into hostility, leading to communal violence that still flares up today. India's military and political landscape remained divided, a result of British recruitment policies that had encouraged loyalty to caste and religion over national unity. The ultimate British strategy, leaving India weak even after their exit. Partition was not an accident, it was the final success of Britain's divide-and-rule strategy. Instead of allowing India to emerge as a unified and strong nation, the British ensured its division, leading to decades of instability, wars, and tensions between India and Pakistan. Even as they physically left, they ensured that the chaos they created would continue. The British conquest of India was not achieved through battlefield victories, but through deception and manipulation. They turned Indian rulers against each other. They divided Indian soldiers to prevent rebellion. They created caste-based and religious divisions that outlasted their rule. The greatest weapon of the British Empire was not their guns or armies. It was their ability to make Indians distrust and fight each other. The truth about British rule, a legacy of division. Even after 75+ years of independence, India and its neighbors continue to deal with the consequences of British divide-and-rule policies. The British did not bring civilization to India. They deliberately weakened one of the world's oldest civilizations. They did not unite India. They divided it in a way that would last long after they were gone. The British physically left in 1947, but their legacy of division remains one of their most lasting impacts. Coming up next, the British justification for empire, the lies of colonization. In the next episode, we expose how the British justified their empire by claiming they were civilizing India, when in reality, they were looting, oppressing, and destroying a nation that had once been one of the richest in the world. Stay tuned for Part 5, The British Lies, How They Justified Their Empire. If you like our videos, please subscribe and press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload new content. Your support helps us uncover hidden history and bring more well-researched stories to light. Don't forget to like, comment, and share to help spread the truth.